Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GMologist Presents. Today, I have Kevin Madison of the Dungeon Musings YouTube and podcast channel. How are you doing today, Kevin?
Good, Carl. How are you?
Good. Yeah, I didn't want to make a lengthy intro, but anyway, I have Kevin here today because we're going to talk about how to run a murder mystery in your RPG game. And
Hmm.
I brought Kevin on because I was subject, victim, participant, player in an awesome game that he ran using Warhammer Fantasy RPG where we had to solve a murder.
Hmm.
And it was great fun. Kevin kept us on track. And now I'm running a murder mystery in my Traveler RPG game that I call Behind the Claw. And I want to see how that goes. And I've picked up some things that I learned when Kevin ran it, but perhaps I can pick his brain a little more today.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing how it's going into Traveler games. It'll be interesting having the tech that's available for players and how that
Yeah,
plays in.
right. Yeah, that is definitely a consideration that I've kind of thought about ahead of
Hmm.
time. And what kind of tech are they going to use? How are they going to use tech? Because you can use even examining the body, right? You
Yeah.
can use tech, and what kind of technology does the ship, for example, that they're in have. But it's like a ship, a luxury liner, and there's like safety, yes, consideration, safety for the passengers, looking out for the passengers, but these are
Hmm.
very wealthy people, so they value their privacy. So there's
Hmm.
some so I think I've already kind of thrown a little bit of that in there. I don't know if the players are frustrated from that, but they're like, we don't have cameras in the rooms. We just don't. It's
Yeah.
a so
Yeah,
stuff
which
like
is a
that.
very real world. Honestly, like this is a non sequitur, but like in my day job, I had one time where we had it very RPG-esque claim where the file came to me and it was in relation to cell phone thefts, and it
Mm,
was some sophisticated criminals who had broken into a Rogers store. Rogers is a cell phone company in Canada. So they broke into a cell phone store by breaking the actual back like brick wall in.
mm,
An alarm went off. They waited an hour because they wanted to see if any security would respond. They didn't respond, and then they made off with 500,000 in cell phones. So at the time, we had security footage of this, and while we were never going to be able to sue the individuals, the security company was supposed to respond in the first hour, and they didn't. So we're like, okay, cool. We've got at least it's not a strong case, but at least something we can advance a claim and potentially settle this thing for less. Do you want to guess what evidence wasn't preserved between the time that the claim was filed and the time claim got to me?
the recordings.
The fucking cell phone footage, exactly. So
Yeah.
the footage totally gone, which means I don't have any evidence that there was a delay in it,
Mm,
and
just
that
curious.
kind of that kind of frustration. So I mean, it meant that like basically we were walking away from it was not likely that we were going to recover the full amount or even maybe half the amount, but there's some money that would have been left on the table that we could have recovered had someone preserved that evidence. And it's just one of those I mentioned it as an example of like a real world thing where like you run into these problems all the time where there's corruption of evidence, where there's someone didn't preserve it or it's unreliable or whatever.
Or it's
And
older
those are
technology even on these cameras, right? It's not. It's
yeah.
it's very poor footage, very pixelated, very grainy. You can't tell anything.
Oh,
Right.
totally. Like if it
Yeah.
happened to turn on like an identity of any of these people, then it wouldn't have mattered. Or if like the timing, if the chronometer that was recording stuff on
Yep.
the cell phone, that would have been a potential problem too. So like the ways that you can put up barriers in the games as well too, even in like superhero games or like games where people have psychic powers or magic or whatnot. There's still all sorts of real barriers that can be set up to make it less of a cakewalk that it might seem to be,
Hmm.
going through these things, right? So,
Yeah. All right. Well, the first question I wanted to ask you is, you had mentioned actually after we ran it that you had run this game before. So I wanted to know like kind of what your inspiration was to pick this particular adventure. And
mm,
you could tell us what it is and we can put it in the show notes for people. We will probably
yeah,
spoil it a little bit. Well, maybe, I don't know. It feels like it's one of those adventures, kind of like Arcturus Station, classic traveler adventure,
yeah, I
where
think
it
we
can
can
be
talk about
different
it
every
without,
time.
yeah, and we
Yep.
can talk about it without actually spoiling it. The adventure is a third-party adventure called Noblesse Oblige that was written originally for Warhammer Fantasy Second Edition, and I think you can find it for free online because it's just a fan-made product. I shouldn't say just, it's a phenomenal adventure. And I ran it the first time several years ago, like 6 or 7 years ago, for my players in the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game campaign that we were running, because Iron Kingdoms there's some parallels that you can find to Warhammer, that I found that it was more fun to adapt those adventures into Iron Kingdoms than it was to use standard D&D ones, because the world is more sophisticated, and it just, I found it made for a more interesting and off the beaten path kind of adventure. And I loved running it the first time. And the first time I ran it, half my group were either law students or lawyers, and they still found difficulty getting like feeling that they had enough evidence.
Mm.
As context for the adventure too, Carl's played through this already, so he knows. But one of the ways this adventure differs from standard RPG murder mysteries is that it is presented in that you're going to collect evidence. There isn't any, there is misleading evidence, but it isn't unfair. Like if you uncover it and whatnot, it's not going to misrepresent what it is. So you can rely on the pieces you have. You can figure out how to fit them together. You may not have the big picture, and things may be misleading, but it isn't unfair. There's no like sudden turn in the last second where it's like, aha, it's something you could not have conceivably figured out. And it's just a matter of like each witness has different evidence you can collect from them, physical and conversational. And then there's also events that happen that trigger throughout the investigation that are
Hmm.
triggered to kind of like keep things moving or whatnot. One of the conversations I've had both times I've run it has been to say, look, it's a murder mystery, which means it's an artificial scenario. You don't need to be looking beyond what you have before you to find the solution to this problem. It is an artificial way of structuring it. And both times we had players, I think they were struggling, like, okay, well, what do we do? But then as soon as you started talking to people and figuring out, like, oh, I've learned this from so and so, and it is a little different from what so and so told me, then the players are more engaged to go and collect more information and help piece together. And as far as the more heavy hand that I put on it was a lot of bringing characters back or players back to say, all right, what do you know so far?
Hmm.
And I did
That's a
that
great
both
idea.
times.
Yeah.
It just sometimes helps because it's not running mysteries in general is just a different process than running your typical like dungeon crawl or sandboxy thing where you're going to go and get involved in intrigue or whatnot, or trying to achieve a certain goal for your own interests or your own faction. With mysteries, there is a matter of collecting evidence, or clues. Do I have enough to solve the mystery right now? If not, where does this point me in the direction of finding more clues? And then
Hmm.
following that path along until you've got enough to get them together. There's different ways you can structure that. The quantum ogre route, where like whatever the players choose to look into, that'll be the right path because you want to get to the end.
Hmm.
But I've having run it both times now, like both sets of players really responded to this kind of structure really well.
Hmm.
And Anna agrees. And I think that the thing that's nice about that structure is it is the most authentic to the kind of piecing together of what happened that you would find in the real world,
Hmm.
which I use Murder She Wrote as an example a lot of times, but like Murder She Wrote uh, is such a great model on which to build mystery campaigns and stuff,
Hmm.
because you get satisfying mysteries introduced, complicated, and resolved in the span of a 45-minute or 48-minute episode. And if you can do
Right.
that
Hmm.
on TV in a satisfying way, then you can do something similar in role-playing games.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. So you didn't quantum ogre us, right? We actually did figure out the
No, you
mystery.
guys actually like that's the thing for those who might be unfamiliar. Quantum Ogre is just kind of an idea in the RPG space that whatever path you take will end up at the thing that the GM has set in front of you, right? Like it
Hmm.
doesn't matter. You can take the road north, south, east of town. You can go underground. You can go overboard. You're going to run into the encounter the DM wants you to run into, which isn't a bad thing because like that's structured encounters are a great thing, or can be a great thing. But in this case, no, there was an actual mystery you uncovered. There was
Hmm.
clearly someone who had done it. And there some RPG modules, they do structure it in such a way that it's multiple people and you kind of decide which one it is, and that's good as well. the thing I just particularly loved about this was it's so well structured that follow the if you follow the evidence and you put it together and it's not to say that like the players don't have any agency, like there is a lot of deductive reasoning that has to go into figuring out who to talk to and what these things mean.
Mhm.
And everyone's talking to each other about that, which is great. Like anytime the players are all talking to each other about plans and whatnot at the table, I absolutely love that stuff. And that in this adventure does such a good job of that. And by having there is a right answer to who did it,
Mhm.
I think means that there's less likelihood of being taken down the wrong path because certain clues or whatnot can't be interpreted in multiple ways. They all point towards this kind of one person once you've chased them down. While there
Right.
are some red herrings, like you guys had a couple of times, you're like, oh, it's this person. Oh, this person I don't trust. And it turns out that there's a number of people involved in Nobles Oblige who are fucking bad people or seemingly
Right.
bad people, but they're not the ones who committed the murder.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, I thought I had a good time with it. I do notice too that at least one of the players, not me, I confess, was writing things down and keeping notes. And I know I already have a player who's doing that. And actually, I think they knew something was up before I introduced. Or I don't know if I had hinted that I was going to run a murder mystery, but they started meeting a lot of wealthy people who really didn't like each other. So he started coming up with like a matrix, like why they don't like each other, what's their relationship, and that's already gonna, I think, help them. So they've done like and we've had a couple session, well, one session, real session of the murder mystery, um, and they've looked at all the physical clues, like found the body, did all the investigation in the room. They have some, based on this guy's matrix, he has some ideas or some
Yeah.
suspects in their mind,
Like
and now they're going to do
there,
the interviews, right?
and that's a great suggestion to make. If players don't take notes typically for this type of adventure, that's another good thing to recommend because like there's a reason that police use like cork boards to put
Hmm.
together all the because sometimes you need to see all that stuff in a manageable format so it's not all just abstracted
Right.
information. This is a non sequitur, but again, like day job stuff, I use to handle enormous amounts of documentation on files. I always have a document chronology for
Mhm.
everything I have because I'm not going to remember 1,500 pages of medical records or stuff like that. But if I have a chronological list of things, then I can see things and I can see patterns and whatever else that is important that I have that come from having a high level view on things and doing a similar matrix of like suspects and evidence that you've got against them and
Mhm.
their alibis or whatever. That's a really helpful way to focus your attention on, okay, well, what didn't we look into right now?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think in both cases too, both my players and I think we found like the physical evidence was very compelling, and we found it pretty quickly and came, I think, to the logical conclusion of like basically how they were killed and what the murder weapon was, right? So I think that
Hmm,
that's pretty important. I think to ground people in
definitely.
pursuing, now I guess the hard part is questioning people, right? That seemed to take the bulk of it, right? In our game too,
It
is
did, and that's
questioning
part of the
people.
fun of it too. Like for the GM side of the screen too, it's really fun role playing out those things. It's work because you need to make sure you're giving the evidence you need without leading the players astray. You don't want to say stuff that accidentally sends them off on a wild goose chase that wasn't
Right.
intended by things.
Mhm.
But it's I find that to be a lot of fun, and I think that the other part of that is whatever the other social considerations are. Like in that adventure, the constraints were that you guys were commoners effectively having to
Right.
deal with a bunch of nobles, and you had borrowed authority because of the nature of the mission that you guys had been sent on. And that was the only reason you're able to question these people. But even then, you still wanted to be cautious, and it seems like there was things you were pushing against
Mhm.
and that I think is a part of the fun as well because like um for the most part you don't adventurers are not going to have regardless of whatever game you're playing they're not going to have restricted ability to go in and do anything in the course of investigation. Playing a
Right.
superhero game you're still going to be constrained by external laws and whatever else too or there'll be consequences that come from that
Mhm.
and even if that like that might feel like for some players is a way of, oh, you're constraining me, but like when you think of it long term, it's also the way of prompting great story later on.
Yeah.
You pissed off people in the course of doing your investigation and whatnot. That's stuff that they're not going to forget probably, and then you might have issues down the road from that. So the course of the investigation, even if you resolve that mystery, you're still going to have great story fodder for later on in your campaign anyway.
Yeah. I think you also need the right sort of players, because I know
Yeah.
it's caused problems when you kind of remind them of that type of authority, right? So superhero game, a superhero can't willy-nilly go hurting civilians, right? There are consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, they can because they have a lot of power, but I mean, they can't. There are consequences, I guess, right?
And that's just it, is the consequence. Like what I typically do when well, we had this come up for one thing too, like where I think your character was gonna sock that stupid bard that was in the party. Remember that there was the bard and he was just pissing you guys off. You're like, I'm gonna fucking hit him.
Oh
And
yeah. Oh,
then
that was in the bar, but yeah, yeah.
yeah. And then
Uh-huh.
like, but when you have that stuff, sometimes it's just like because it's a game and we're not actually occupying the world. It's just a matter of like, okay, hold on, let's just understand what the context was and what the
Mhm.
consequences will be. And
Right.
once we went through that, you're like, oh, okay, I'm not going to do that
It's a
then.
bad idea. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's not necessarily that's a bad idea. It'll bring things in a very different direction then.
Hmm.
And that's not I really try not to, because I'm fortunate to play with, like, I don't play with players who intentionally sabotage things. So more often than not, when they're trying to do something, there's a reason behind it, and there's, so sometimes it's a matter of maybe I've miscommunicated something, or they've misunderstood something, or they really
Hmm.
want to do something that I didn't anticipate. And going through that and saying like, okay, here's the consequences that are likely to come from this stuff. I'm fine with you doing this, but just so you're aware, this is what might be perceived as, and here's what the likely consequences are. That's not me slapping the, don't do this because it's contrary to the story. It's making clear this is what the consequences are likely to be. So like definitely go ahead and do it if you like, but we'll be in a different kind of story after that. And
Right.
that's not a bad thing. It just means that you might find yourself in a different I've yet to have any people we play with on the channel ever, like, once it's always a misunderstanding of how I presented things, or I've done a poor job of presenting the situation. Once it's clarified, they're like, oh, okay, hold on, no, I don't intend to do that.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, even if they did, it just means that the story's going in a different direction, and if you're playing a pre-written like adventure path type thing where the actions in one module are going to have consequences for 4 more of them or 5 more of them,
Mm.
then maybe that's a problem. But
Right.
the types of games I typically run are always kind of open-ended anyway, so where they go with it is not really a concern of mine. I just need to find interesting things to have happen in the next stage of the campaign, whatever it's become.
Yeah. And you mentioned directing players a little earlier, and I think we probably want to talk a little bit about that, or talk about that. In that you reminded us that the only people that are likely to be involved are the people that you're introducing, right?
Hmm.
Even though there are a lot of it turns out faceless NPCs, right? So right, there's all
Yeah.
these soldiers, there's like the drivers of the wagons that, or the coaches that we're with. Um, and then like in the case of the traveler adventure that I'm running, right, there's the crew, right, and a lot of other passengers that they haven't met. But I mean, even though I know you mentioned it and I mentioned it, there still was a player who's like, well, what about all these other people, right?
Yeah, and I think because it's different, there are different styles of approaching the mysteries, and like the one way of approaching that is a perfectly valid way too, and that I use in other things, is that you have clues, and there are many ways to get them, right? Like there's many ways to figure out the information you need to be able to piece together. Our Paradar adventures are very much like that, where I don't have, like, they don't need to speak to the right person. They can get information a number of different ways, and that was true in this adventure as well. It's just that it's a locked room scenario, right? Where
Mhm.
like you're not going anywhere, you're not going off something, nothing's changing in the interim. It's a very limited, period, a bottle episode, as it were.
Mhm.
But for games like Call of Cthulhu or any other sort of, that's the one I think of as the most clearly mystery focused or investigative focused.
Mhm.
With those kind of games, things can change in between and shit can happen. So uh, having the having the accessibility for more places, I think, in my mind, like, with the bottle episode 1, and only 8 like meaningful NPCs to talk to, then that is an easier amount to cover. And I think it's
Mhm.
less, it feels like, I can't speak from a player's side, but it, to me, it probably is less artificial than by saying, here's 4 people you're going to meet. These are the people who are important for the purpose of this artificial murder mystery structure we're playing. You can talk to anyone else you want to, but this is not the kind of adventure where you're gonna, everything we're playing and everything that matters is on the board, right? The Chekhov's gun kind of thing, where
Right.
we've introduced these characters. It means that they're consequential. Investigate at your will. That probably is less artificial than saying, here's the 5 locations you can go to, right?
Mhm.
Across,
Right.
Arkham. And if you go to anywhere else, you're not going to find it. Like, that to me feels a little more, because you've already opened up the possibilities of travel and things happening in between and whatnot. Um, the but you're right. I think that having the players stay on, having a clear communication of what is happening in it. If you're running a murder mystery, that's the focus of the or not just a murder mystery, but like any kind of mystery where it involves investigative, collecting information and going on. Um, it's good at making sure that players remember and reminding them this is what this exercise is. This is not a
Mhm.
matter of, for you to not get frustrated, you're going to want to be aware of how you progress in this story, as opposed to like, if you're playing a dinner party thing, you're going to want to
Mhm.
talk to people and then kind of figure out what the story is, or, progressing in a dungeon, or, whatever your setting equivalent of that is, progressing the mission in Shadowrun. That stuff has a different metric for measuring how far along you get in towards your successful goal. Mystery requires you to remember all times that I'm trying to get enough information so I can piece together what's happened, and there will
Right.
be shit happening in the course of that exercise. It's one of the great things that Eberron also, it's the Raymond Chandler thing, that if you ever find that you get bored in a session or things slow down, have some bad guys with a gun kick through the door, right? So
Yeah.
you still not lose the thread of the mystery, but give it a little more of an action influence. But ultimately, reminding the players, this is what you're here for, and here's what the kind of, I don't think you need to be quite as artificial as what I was necessarily, but it's also it's worth remembering too, like, you're playing an RPG. It's not another kind of media. You're not playing, if it was a video game, it's a much more restricted format too, but like, that is restricted by the format of the play, and so are RPGs.
Mhm.
You know, the murder mysteries, or whatever your mystery is a construct that is artificial. And because it's artificial, it's gonna have gaps in it. It's just the nature of these sort of artificial scenarios. And if people pick at the holes or the gaps in it, it's going to affect the overall structure of the
Yeah.
mystery. And that's where it can be like, well, no, you know, this is what this mystery is about.
Mhm.
And if players insist on focusing on the edges of things, it sort of is, it runs contrary to the spirit of what you're trying to do with the mystery, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that's where, again, it differs from like a murder mystery novel or a film or TV show, where the players do have active involvement, but that's goes beyond just playing their characters and investigating the things and responding to situations. It's also showing good sportsmanship, right? RPGs are a team activity. It's remembering that, okay, there's going to be artificial holes in this stuff. My job isn't to outsmart the person who wrote the adventure. My job is to play with my friends and my fellow players and see us through to the resolution of this mystery, not to outsmart whoever wrote it.
Right. Or he's trying to
Right.
run it if you're running
Or whoever's
some.
trying to run it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, and like that can, and that's another thing that, for from the GM side, I think it's perfectly fine to be like, listen, you know what? I fucked up on something. I mentioned this, but I actually meant, this is what I mentioned by that. I misspoke when I said whatever. Having having the ability to do that with your players. Some players are going to feel, oh, it takes me out and whatnot. And all right, I mean, but it's not fucking VR. Like, it's not the
Mhm.
Matrix you're in. It's a role playing game, and there are people who are running the role playing games, and people responding to other people, and sometimes things get overlooked or get mistaken. So that's where it's good to go back and if you have that comfort level on the GM side to say, listen, I fucked up. I told you that so and so saw X at there. It's actually Y. That was my fault. I misspoke
Mhm.
on that. So, I think being able to go back and do that rather than trying to rewrite the mystery after the fact, especially if you're running a pre-written thing. If you're doing the quantum ogre thing or something similar where like the clues might lead to one of multiple suspects, that's fine because then you'll see where the players where they put it all together to do it. One of the advantages of having the singular victim too, or singular, culprit, is you avoid Hitchcock's thing of the fridge moment, where like as long as you can get through the film, the sort of paraphrasing of it is that if you get through a film of his, and then you're in the fridge, grabbing a midnight snack, and you're like, wait a minute, that element didn't make sense. He doesn't really care about that because, like, if you were in it in the moment and you accepted it in the moment, that's fine.
Mhm.
But if after the fact you have those lingering things, I think you're less likely to have fridge moments when there isn't multiple resolutions to it because there's not going to be like, well, wait a minute, like I uncovered this kind of thing that seemed to be indicating towards so and so, and that doesn't tie into who actually ultimately did it. So why is that the case? And
Mhm.
like that's just I don't think that's fatal to it's not fatal to films, but nor is it fatal to your campaign or to your mystery adventure because like again it's an artificial construct. It's a dynamic situation as people are playing their characters and investigating things, so you don't know what's gonna come of it and what things will be left on the side of the road or what players will fixate on and being like, how come this happened? That didn't make sense. But if you have a singular culprit for your mystery, that's less likely for that kind of fridge moment to happen.
Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's curious. So I have another something that did not come up in our game, and it may come up because of technology in the Traveler game, is the use of divination magic. Do you think that
Yeah,
divination magic can what if we had a wizard, maybe like like a gray mage or whatever, that I think
yeah.
to have some ways to pierce through illusion or something like that.
So it's interesting you say that because we've actually got in our Wrath and Glory game, we have a psychic, right? And the
Mm,
psychics can read minds
right.
and whatever. And in Wrath and Glory, they're a little more reliably competent than what they are in some of the Fantasy Flight games or an Imperium Maledictum. And the way that I think of those is, or at least the way I write for them, is as if it was any other clue. Because
Mm,
I'm not looking at how you get the information, I'm looking at what the information is.
okay. Good
The
point.
reason that you're getting this is something from Gumshoe, but like the reason in it, the way they describe it, the reason the clues exist is to get you acting on something else. The interesting thing in a mystery is not how do I find the clue necessarily, it's what does this mean?
Hmm.
Like there is the action part of it definitely comes from the trying to find the clues, and that's where if you have certain character abilities and whatnot, that can be ways of obtaining that information. And it gives them the players spotlight time, whether they're canny investigators or they're magical detectives or diviners or they're psychics.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's just information they're getting. They're not solving everything. Like if they have an opportunity to scan the bad guy who did the bad thing, um, maybe that's bad, but a lot of settings have inbuilt restrictions in the fiction for
Hmm.
why you can't do that. Like in Shadowrun, Shadowrun has mind probing and whatnot is a spell you can take right off the bat and whatnot, but none of that shit is admissible in court.
Hmm.
You can't summon spirits and have them give testimony in Shadowrun because none of that stuff is admissible. And with psychics, even if you have that information, how does that like what's the consequence of that? Unless they are judge, jury, and executioner, the players are still only in a position where like they know stuff, and you can actually use that I think to your advantage too, where if you reveal it, think of how much fun it is when like there's a degree of fun of like the whodunits, whether it's a movie or film or whatnot, where I'm like, I don't know who did this shit, but there's also a degree of like, I fucking know who did it, and I'm waiting to see them uncovered, right? Like
Yeah.
Dexter's whole thing is about that, right? Like we know who the murderer is right from the get-go of that thing, and then there's both kinds of mysteries. So there's a whodunit in that first season and as well, but
Hmm.
the for those ones, I think the way to think of it is less like, oh, it's such a problem because it's going to break my mysteries. And role playing superhero role playing games spill a lot of ink on
Oh
how
yeah,
this
for
causes
sure.
problems, right?
Hmm.
But I think that if you think of it in terms of, or you're structuring your mystery in such a way where the information that they're going to gather from those things, you just need to be aware of how they're doing that, and then how they're going to how they are going to get to the ultimate resolution of it, which is, I'm assuming, proof or whatever.
Hmm.
If the question is, oh, I don't know who killed so and so, that might be an issue. But you know, maybe go beyond that of like, well, why did they do it? They're the
What's the motive?
Latin
Yeah.
maxim of cui bono, of who profits,
Hmm.
is something that is what I think of all the time when I'm writing mysteries is um who's it getting the advantage of the crime, right? Like there's an action of there's a question of who did the crime, but why did they do it? And one of the ways to analyze that is, well, who profits from whatever just happened?
Hmm.
And if if you know who did it, that's fine. But like in our Warhammer game, they used their psychic powers to track down this fixer who was responsible for this attack on them after they arrived on Footfall. And what they got out of it was the name of another house. So great, they know who set them up, they know who's attacking them, but they don't know why yet. They don't know who specifically was responsible for that, and they don't know how they're going to respond. But it sets up a looming threat for them. So even though they're able to access that information quite easily, in that particular setup, it's not consequential. It just makes things more interesting. It doesn't ruin the fun. It makes it
Right.
more challenging.
Yeah, true. And I mean, similarly, like in Traveler, if you did have a psyker or someone who used psionic powers on board, if you're playing Imperium, but that might not be. How are you gonna tell people that you just did that, right?
Oh,
So
totally. Yeah.
so
Well,
it's
even
in.
like because you're a longtime Call of Cthulhu guy too. You remember the haunting from because it's been in like almost every
Everything, right?
edition. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just amazing event. I've run that a ton of times, and once as a traveler game actually, and where it was a haunted planet, and then once as a Green Lantern adventure where it was
Mm-hmm.
again a haunted planet. And you know, with the amount of capabilities that the players have as their ring at their disposal, all it means is less, legwork to get some of the information
Yeah.
because they're able, if you think of what you're doing in that adventure is there's a little bit of physical investigation, there's a little bit of research, and then there's piecing together what goes on there. And there's experiences you have that, can cause problems, cause danger, and also shed some light on what might be going on.
Mm-hmm.
And you can easily, so if you think of it just in those terms, it's easy to scale it up to being a planet instead of being like, oh, there was someone who's, not to spoil that adventure for anyone, but there's a key part of it, key bit of evidence where you're learning about someone and there's a gap in their history. You're like, well, what the fuck happened during that?
Right.
And all I did for ours to make it a galactic scale is I just scaled out the time a lot further back,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's the Guardians of Oa have been around for 1 billion years, so I can make this a much more space opera style or scale of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they had crazy abilities and whatnot, they still all that did is just at the end of the day in a Call of Cthulhu adventure that you want them to find the clues and then piece it together. This just means it's a different way of getting a hold of that information. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think it shows what a really well-designed mystery can be. It's extremely flexible and can be repurposed for a whole bunch of different settings because the core principles of what makes it an engaging and fun mystery are all there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. It's like the gumshoe philosophy is like you find the clues, now what do you do with them, right? So
Precisely.
that's
And that's
exactly.
where it like there's fun having the action. I think for me, Gumshoe, like the action part of Gumshoe is not satisfying enough. So I don't tend to run any of them now at least. But the idea of approaching mysteries that way, that
Mhm.
it should never be a dice roll that keeps you from a clue.
Right.
A dice roll should provide context or some kind of connected thing. Yeah, you get the clue, but then someone now knows what's happened or whatever, like something
Mhm.
that makes the investigation more complicated or more complicated also tends to mean more interesting for the players. So, you know, that's I haven't run a mystery with what do you call it with Genesis yet that I can think of, and I'll bet you that
Mhm.
would be just a ton of fun to play.
Yeah, I guess like a Star. I guess you could do it with like the new L5R, right? That's Genesis now, but
Yeah, we
I mean,
actually
obviously, I mean, it looks like you've repurposed adventures and put them in a sci-fi context that were not originally for that. So, Star Wars, right? A Star Wars mystery.
Star Wars should be really good.
Yeah.
We ran our first campaign playing Legend of the Five Rings, the Fantasy Flight one. That was a murder mystery.
Mm,
There was
cool.
a Ronin who got murdered, and it was a matter of the characters going around. It was a lot of fun. And it gave you a lot of like opportunity to play in that world. It's something that I think, well, like getting back to your mystery and Traveler, one of the fun things one of the things I love the most about Traveler, the game, is the setting, is just occupying stuff in the setting. It is a rock solid sci-fi setting where you have clear answers for what everything, like every bit of technology, you have a clear answer for what it can and cannot do. And that's sometimes a challenge with sci-fi stuff, is understanding like, all right, so is this like Star Wars interstellar travel, or is this like Star Trek interstellar travel, where like I can own a single vessel, and on my own can kind of zip between solar systems, or is it the kind of thing where only the technology can support a big, a big vessel that can support a certain plan? How long does it take us to get between them, and how far
Right.
can scanners go?
Right.
It's so good having all that stuff clear, because in a setting where you're making up everything, there are already clear boundaries for what can and cannot be done with that
Hmm.
technology that's inbuilt in there. It's rare you're going to come up with like, and then there's the magic nonsense that breaks all the rules you have. Like you can rely on those fantastic elements to be able to figure out how you're going to structure and how you're going to respond to these kinds
Hmm.
of mysteries.
Right. Well, cool.
Mm.
Well, I don't know. I really wasn't thinking of how many questions I was going to ask you, but I think, we talked a lot and you've given a lot of advice already, but maybe in a more concise, structured way. It might be a challenge, I know. But what advice would you give then to a GM who would like to run a murder mystery or investigative,
Well, I mean, for the first, would definitely try it. I think that it doesn't matter what kind of game you're running, you can run something like that. A D&D adventure is as much fun, as what. So a lot of the Ravenloft ones are just not the original modules, but a lot of the ones that came out after the second edition box set came out.
Mhm.
A lot of those are interesting mysteries as well.
Right?
Um, I think that yeah, like I don't have, apart from saying definitely try it, I would be mindful that if you find that your players are not used to that kind of thing, be willing to talk more openly about what the meta structure is for
Hmm.
that type of thing, because uh having the shift from D&D brain, honestly, we've had this happen in a couple of campaigns where we've been playing a long time, where there's one type of adventure we've been playing, and then we transition to something else, and everyone has to step back. Whereas in like our Paradar game, everybody knows what you're doing by now. We've been playing it for 2 years, 2 years, 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and everyone knows sort of how they're approaching this stuff. Like, okay, I'm going to slowly start piecing stuff together. In the same way that watching an episode of Murder She Wrote is different from watching an episode of like Star Trek.
Hmm.
There's a different type of story you're going through. My advice would be, just if you do find that there is difficulty with that, be transparent with your players,
Hmm.
with how you're choosing to do it. And there's not a right or wrong way to structure your mystery. You can do it where you figure out, watch the players try and piece together clues and see what makes most sense as what is the reason. And you can have that be the reason that things conclude if you want to improvise it. You can also have a clear idea, in which case you're going to want to make sure you have multiple ways of reaching the end, the same way you would structure any other kind of, structured campaign or structured adventure. Just definitely try it.
Yeah.
If it's something that sounds of interest to you, I would give it a try, because it can be a really refreshing thing for players to play in too, to have a different way of thinking about their characters, different way of interacting with them, and seeing different abilities come to the forefront, because they might be more important in the course of an investigation than they would be otherwise in like whatever other thing they're doing in their campaign.
Right. I think another important thing is to make sure that the characters are the stars of the show, right? That they're
100%.
Angela Lansbury and company, figuring out the mystery. I know that, I mean, especially like in a game where why don't you just let the authorities do it? Why are we the ones chosen to
Exactly.
why are we
Yeah.
solving this mystery? Why can't like in our case, Priest of Sigmar, why don't you guys solve the mystery? But you gotta.
Exactly. Yeah, and having that reason, that's a really good point because having the players clear that it's their problem,
Yeah.
right? Like that is whether that's because the client wants to see them see this through, or whether they've got some personal, you don't need to have that a player character's brother or sister or whatnot is murdered and then they've got that personal investment. There can be other incentives for it too.
Mhm.
And you can complicate things too by changing those incentives partway through, right?
Yeah.
If they're well on their way to solving a mystery and someone else comes forward and says, you know what, I'm going to pay you double to just fucking sweep this under the rug, that can
Right.
introduce some interesting complications to it as well. But that would, or add more context for like, oh wait, who is that guy? Why is he? And that might be a way of further giving more information to the players to be able to play with to figure out what they're going to do next or how they're going to go. And the other thing I would say is what I think this adventure does well, and a lot of other ones do, is triggered events. If the classic, kind of horror investigative mystery when I was a kid, sometimes you'd have times where it's like fucking 2 hours where players are trying to piece shit together and like that's not fun, that's frustrating and whatnot. But if you pace it up or break it up with interesting kind of things, that Chandler-esque, kicking the door down and people are, that gives someone a chance to change things, and you can also introduce information that way. If players get stuck and they need a little tip towards it,
Hmm.
because sometimes players need that extra bit of, they're not their characters, they're role playing as their characters, but they don't see or understand or whatnot everything that the character necessarily does. And giving context, I guess, one of the things that is really was helpful in, I think, our game is talking about the context of what certain clues meant. If your
Hmm.
world isn't whatever type of daily world that you guys interact with, you sometimes need to give context for like, it's unusual for like in our murder mystery, when you guys uncovered that really expensive dagger,
Yeah.
right? On what's her name? You're like, why the hell does a camp follower have this thing on her?
Yeah.
And whatever your setting is, it's important to give that context because it's not the players aren't passively making their way through a mystery the way you are when you read a novel or watch a thing. They're having to, there's more that's asked of them. So you need to make sure the evidence is clear and unambiguous for them so they understand what's important and what the context is. Um, Especially if you're playing, even in person, this is true, but if you're playing online,
Hmm.
connections can be lost sometimes.
Right.
People are distracted by things. So it's never a bad thing to put your thumb on the scale, as it were, and just being like, okay, let's go through what you guys know so far. And as they go through it, you can, as a GM, you can sometimes be like, oh, well, hold on, did you learn that? And if there's a misapprehension, people could be like, oh yeah, it was so and so who wrote that note, and they maybe just recorded things down wrong, and you're like, no, 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 that was so and so, that was a different person who did that. And then that gives them like, oh, this is why this wasn't making sense to me, is because I misunderstood one component.
Hmm.
An RPG is not living real life so you're not having the full benefit of being fully immersed in there. And you're also not occupying that world 24/7. So
Right.
when you play every 2 weeks or every week or every month, you need that extra bit of reminder for the players to be like, yeah, this is the shit that's important. This is stuff. Here's what it means, so they can make those decisions. And you've got the authority to be able to take steps to try and resolve things.
Yeah. Never mind. Also, players who might miss a session, they got to get caught up, and it's a good
100%.
excuse to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're not playing a life simulation in this type of thing. You're playing a murder mystery,
Hmm.
So you're not trying to accurately, where people have to pay attention to every single thing. You're not handing people the answers to the questions. So, and I guess one thing, I will posit stuff out loud so people can put things into context. If I'm missing something, I feel like they're missing something in context, sometimes I will ask leading questions, and leading questions is questions that presume an answer.
Hmm.
So it'll be, we had this in our recent Paradar game because there was just there was some people coming and going. We're playing a Starfinder mystery right now, and there was one bit that I felt was being missed here. So we talked through a bit of like what the evidence means, what I think it means in the greater context. And that got us to the point where they were like, oh, he's not what I thought he was. He's actually, more likely something else.
Hmm.
And that's I think some GMs, especially if you're of uh the like really hands off, let players do whatever they want. You may be reluctant to do that kind of thing, but I think it's really helpful because you're not pushing the players towards a conclusion. You are helping them understand the context of what they've learned things are, and to really make that big picture crystallize as they're putting it together.
Right. So give them
So
like a review, almost like this is what you guys already learned before.
yeah,
Not it's not the GM tell GM sort of guiding them as opposed to directing them, I guess.
and that's exactly it. Is like especially if you're framing it by way of questions,
Mhm.
like saying who did you talk to so far? Well, I talked to so and so, so and so, so and so. Well, is that everyone? Oh no, we didn't talk to so and so yet, did we? Okay, let's go talk to that guy, or whatever. And that asking it the questions that way, I think, also helps the players thinking altogether. So yeah, I mean that I think is recognizing that you're all trying to get to the same goal, which is to solve the mystery.
Mhm.
Sometimes there just needs to be a little extra help with it, which is not the case with, you know, um, if you miss a room in a dungeon, players can always go back to that and they'll be able to see that thing. And that's not really what, unless you're playing a completist kind of adventure, it's not the same type of thing where you overlook something. Whatever's happening in the moment is what's important in a lot of RPGs, and in a mystery, it just requires you to be paying a little more attention to what you've come across and what you've uncovered, so you can get to the resolution of that, which is piece together whatever it is that happens so you can then take action.
Mhm. Okay, well, one last question. What's the
Yeah.
next mystery?
Next mystery. What are we doing right now?
I guess you mentioned Paradar, but like I said,
Yeah, Paradar, we've got that one is still resolving. I'm trying to think what next. Our Dragon Age. Actually, we've got a
oh,
two-part Dragon Age
okay.
one that's coming up that is going to have a mystery element that you're playing in, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so there's a
I'll
mystery
cover
element
my
in that
ears.
one. No, but that one is having an element of mystery to it too. There is I mean, we're wrapping up this weekend our Conan game, and that was a really uh that one had an element of mystery to it because the players had to figure out the context of what was going, it's set in Shem, and I won't spoil anything from it, but there was a lot of like they thought they understood things and then
Oh.
investigated further and like, oh, this is so much worse than I thought. Oh no. You know,
Yep. Yep.
yeah, I don't know, but oh, you know what? The next purely dedicated mystery thing I can say is Lex Arcana. We've got a Lex Arcana
Oh, yeah.
session, yeah, coming up in April, I think is that one, and that one's going to be great. For those listening at home, if you're not familiar with Lex Arcana, it's kind of a fantasy first century Roman Empire thing where you're playing agents of the Empire solving mysteries. It's like X-Files with togas and spells.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
How about you? What's your next mystery
Yeah,
after
I
the
think
Traveler one?
after the Traveler, I mean, I've been wanting to jump back into Call of Cthulhu, and you know, my wife Amy's a big fan of Casablanca, and then
Mm.
Sons of Singularity, that you might know for the Cezanne Files, but they just came out with a Blessed and the Blasphemous, which takes place in Morocco, and
Oh, cool.
there's even a one of the sub adventures, one of the adventures in there is you're part of a movie set, So I think that would be kind
Mm.
of a neat place to put it, and I'm just to be able to jump back into Call of Cthulhu. I think that'd be something that I'm
Yeah.
contemplating.
Well, Acton
Although,
Cthulhu.
although I started Harn too. I just started this Harn
Oh
adventure,
yeah.
the Saga of Gundar Green Eye, and the whole thing is like a mystery. It's like your parents were killed almost in front of you. Your parents rescued you last second, and you got a glimpse of the people who killed them. Now you got to track them down across the length and breadth of the world, apparently.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, it should be pretty fun.
When you're speaking of North Africa, you're what do you call it? I'm not sure if you're keeping up with or interested in the 2D20 Act on Cthulhu, but
Yes,
that
I like that.
Serpents and Sand one is
Oh, yeah.
really
That's one
fucking
of the
cool.
ones. That's one of the ones that I proposed to my players. We're running a Toon Cthulhu adventure now, and I just kind of rolled up the adventure sort of from the in the game master's kit. They can randomly roll up an adventure for
Hmm.
Toon Cthulhu, and it ended up being so the players were a Norwegian uh, partisan and then two Russians,
Oh,
So I said
cool.
it.
That's
I
cool.
said it in 1940s Norway, and they're trying to stop the Nazis from getting some sort of Norwegian god's artifact. But of
Oh,
course,
nice.
it's been very convoluted, and now they finally met
Yeah,
and
yeah.
found out where the artifact is, and it's definitely not what they seem. So I think if
Nice.
I'm going to give them like some choices, I mean, I really liked the one that we played, the Atlantis, the first one of the Atlantis one,
Yeah, yeah,
the Vienna episode. So that's a possibility. But Forest of Fear is really fascinating, although that one
yeah.
seems more pulpy action as opposed to like investigative mystery.
Well, that's what this Serpents and Sand one is definitely more like a lot of the archetypes they include in that are expressly more pulp,
Mhm.
oriented than military oriented.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, it gives you different play experience. But that's when I like what I would am more interested in doing with that is more the Indiana Jones,
yeah.
pulp kind of stuff than I am the military stuff. But yeah, cool.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Kevin. And
Yeah,
I'm
thanks
really
so much for
glad I
having
played in
me.
your Warhammer game. It's been a very fun campaign to play. It's always good, I think. I'm running Enemy Within. I've been running that for almost 3 years, this March actually. And we're on book 4,
Mhm.
halfway done with book 4, but it's really good to play in a game that you also run to kind of,
Yeah.
you know, learn from the player's point of view how things go, I think
Well,
has
and
been
it's
really
great
helpful.
playing like with you and Sean and Darren. Like you guys are so interested. You're either running it or you're really interested in running it. So it's super helpful for a game like that where there's a lot of nuance to it.
Yeah.
Like Sean told me from the outset, he's like, it's a pretty complicated game. There's a lot of stuff going on. And I was like, Shaw, like we run tons of games and
Yeah, there's
seeing how many things are moving, you're having to keep track of on the flow. He's absolutely right. Like there's a
mhm.
lot of moving parts, but with that many game masters, like Warhammer game masters in the game, it really makes it easy to run. And I really, really enjoy that campaign.
Yeah. Well, thank you for running.
Nice.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Good night and good rolling.